And to kick off our afternoon sessions, I'm delighted to be joined for a fireside chat by Ian Adams, the Director of Membership and Stakeholder Engagement at the NHS. Hi Ian, how are you today?
I'm very well, thanks, Kathy. Good to be here.
Excellent, thank you. No, we're glad to have you. So I'm going to dive right in by saying, can you begin by telling us a little bit about your background and your role in the NHS today?
Yeah, well, first of all, huge thanks to Engage for inviting me to join your event today. I work for an organisation called NHS Resolution, and we provide indemnity cover to every hospital and every GP practice in England. So we're basically the NHS's in-house insurer, and my role is Director of Engagement. Throughout my career, I've really been supporting major public policy initiatives. I had the privilege of working on some very significant developments impacting on many millions of citizens' lives, including the rollout of automatic enrolment pensions, digital TV switchover, and also the introduction of technology in classrooms across schools in England. And today, as I say, working in quite a sensitive part of the NHS, so we deal with negligence claims when things go wrong from time to time in the NHS. Will step in and settle compensation. And I think the key driver in terms of today's Engage event is looking at all of that work through an ED and I lens, and very much the work that I've done throughout my career, Kathy, has been very much focused on looking to provide services to particularly underserved and excluded citizens, people that are at risk of being left behind. Brilliant,
thank you, Ian. So why specifically is EDI so important to an employer such as NHS Resolution?
First and foremost, I'm sure like many of your viewers today working for whether they're listed organisations on the stock exchange or, in my case, publicly funded organisations, in all of those regards, many organisations, of course, accountable to citizens, either as customers or taxpayers, or arguably both. And, the NHS is here to provide that universal service. So, my starting point is that we, as a key part of the public sector, we really ought to be representative of the citizens, of the people that we're serving.
Yeah, and I really identify with that. So I run a small organisation in Birmingham, and we deal with some very marginalised communities. And it's important to me that the makeup of my organisation represents the communities that we're supporting, just as a basic first step, really, in making sure that we're the most effective organisation that we can be. And I think that's as important for tiny organisations like mine as it is for huge public sector organisations like the NHS and its various parts. So I think, it is always important to have that visible representation, as it were, even if it's just in the way that you are thinking about what you provide. During the pandemic, obviously, we know that the NHS particularly has stood up and worked incredibly hard for all of us. In NHS Resolution particularly, how have you supported staff during the pandemic?
Yeah, obviously this has been a massive topic for all of us, both as employers and as workers, and clearly not just in the UK, but globally. First of all, I'm really proud of the way that I and my fellow directors here at NHS Resolution provided what I would describe, Kathy, as a very compassionate response to supporting staff during the crisis. And it genuinely was a crisis. I'm sure if everyone casts their minds back to March 2020, when we had that sudden shift instruction from the Prime Minister to work at home, stay indoors, etc., etc. So it was a genuine shock to the system. And I think, that then pivoted my organisation into regular kind of business continuity mode, keeping the organisation up and running, ensuring that we have the right technology to support people at home, and more particularly ensure that we have the technology to keep people engaged with what was going on in the workplace from both a health and safety perspective, not just the physical aspect of finding yourself at home working, but also the mental health and well-being aspects as well.
Were there any members of your staff that you felt particularly struggled with it? So were there people that you could identify that had more difficulty, either through job role or through, for whatever reason, really?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kathy. I think less job role. Most of our roles are desk-based,
Yeah.
computer-based, so there's no kind of physical element per se. But I think, you know, we're an organisation of around 500 people. So within that spread, inevitably there's going to be a distribution of some colleagues who have mental health needs and requirements around their mental well-being. And that certainly was one key concern of ours. I mean, clearly there are very sensitive issues for employers regarding the mental well-being of staff. You know, it's a self-declared point that staff need to inform the employer about. So that there's an element of confidentiality. So providing assurance to workers that you've got their best interest in mind when it comes to ascertaining, you know, what are the real situations, what are the real challenges on the ground. So that's one dimension, and I think another, perhaps an even more obvious dimension, was the physical aspect of people's different home working setups. We deliberately here at NHS Resolution took a very flexible approach. So staff were allowed to work from anywhere they wished, providing, of course, they could get a broadband signal, because clearly they need to be connected to the office system in order to do their job. But we found that a lot of young people, and we're generally London-based, albeit we have an office in Leeds as well, but a lot of people, particularly in London, chose to leave their rented accommodation to go back to their parents' homes. And I think that in itself was a good additional element of support that some of the young people could call upon. But of course, we must also all remember, Kathy, that, you know, some people continue to live in pretty sort of challenging physical environments. I mean, I'll give you one example of a young newly married couple in my own team. And, you know, they've moved into a one-bed rented apartment in southwest London. And, of course, a few months into their married life together, they're both struggling to work online in quite a cramped situation.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so that whole move to home working presumably shone a light on workforce diversity and inclusion for you. And how did that sort of manifest itself? What did you realise from having dispatched everybody to work from home that perhaps will influence how you work in the future? Yeah,
well, first and foremost, an employer should never make assumptions about people's domestic setups. You know, I think also that there's the point of the workplace coming into someone's private space, and I think that in my mind raises a lot of quite sensitive issues that can be properly addressed, properly managed, providing the employer is attuned to them. For example, you know, not encouraging overly inquisitive conversations around what might be on display behind people's shoulders. I mean, I'm sitting in my office here in Canary Wharf today, so I've deliberately chosen a black wall, so there's no distraction. But you know, what I mean by that, Kathy, is, you know, the discreetly or perhaps not so discreetly placed family photograph, which in some regards might be pretty innocuous, but in others, you know, an innocent question around who else is in the picture might actually lead to, how can I say, the crossing of a line. So one needs to, I guess, respect those boundaries, particularly when it comes to video calls.
It is a fine line, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that I found was that I've enjoyed the greater connection that I've experienced with people, because I can see sometimes, you know, their backgrounds or their pets or their children, and so as a leader I've had perhaps a greater sense of connection through what people have felt able to share, you know, an insight into their lives that I perhaps would have not had before. But I do agree it's a boundary that you need to be very careful with, I think.
I'd agree with that, and then of course it impacts different workers in different ways. So thinking particularly, I don't know about your company, Kathy, but we've recruited quite a number of people during the pandemic. So everyone that was being recruited were being recruited on a video call system, And that in itself raised challenges about people feeling potentially isolated, cut off from their new colleagues, not getting that initial exposure to the coaching and mentoring that is a natural part of joining a new team and a new organisation.
Yes, no, well, I agree with that from personal experience. So I was completely interviewed by video and, started in the pandemic, as did one of my managers. And in fact, she joined in complete lockdown. At least my experience was slightly freer. But it does absolutely change that dynamic of coming into an organisation and how you develop the workplace connections that are so useful to you, and obviously connect into that knowledge that is there that normally you would just absorb through being side by side with people. How have you sought to address the challenges that it's raised? And is that influencing what you do in the future now? So have you really changed the way that you work and are not going back, or are you progressing forward in a new direction, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of so-called hybrid working, I think a lot of employers, NHS resolution included, we're finding our way, we're feeling our way through this forest of discovery, if you like. I mean, there's no single playbook, and although we hear certain commentators proclaiming a return back to the office writ large is a good thing, actually I think a cautious and managed approach is probably sensible. What we did here at NHS Resolution, we surveyed all of our workforce about this time last year, in fact, the end of November last year, just to start to engage with them about the prospect of potentially returning to an office situation, what their preferences might be in terms of numbers of days per week, etc. And that initial engagement set a kind of base level of benchmark, if you like, for determining the when and the how of return to office. And within that survey, Kathy, we also were particularly keen to draw out, again, going back to the confidentiality piece that I mentioned earlier, any specific requirements from staff, whether it was around cramped accommodation, people with poor connectivity at home, or people who were either new to the organisation but for whatever reason felt cut off from others around them and wanted to re-engage with people in a kind of three-dimensional office setting. So when we eventually reopened the office, we gradually reopened from spring of this year. We prioritised people with either mental health requirements, connectivity requirements, or physical needs based on their home setup. So we segmented our workforce around that priority group.
And so during that period where everybody was at home, did you change practices to bring in things that enabled people to feel more connected to each other, and to perhaps facilitate the communication that might have happened face to face? Because I think it'd be really interesting to know what you did.
Absolutely, Kathy. We did a huge amount of added value employee engagement. So lots of informal meetings and engagements were encouraged. So Tea for Three is one example, whereby randomly you're invited to have a cup of tea, virtually or otherwise, with two other colleagues across the business, people you probably have never met before. So again, there's a kind of nice getting to know people through that. My own team were often meeting virtually for lunch. I've got another example of a team, our policy team, often have the MS Teams system switched on for 1 or 2 afternoons a week, but not to engage with anyone, just to have a bit of white noise, working in a kind of virtual office environment. And of course, you can speak to people if you wish to, but that's not the point. It's just knowing you're connected to people. So a lot of additional interventions, and we ramped up our kind of mainstream existing employee comms channels as well. So more regular emails going out to all staff, support to line managers, lots of business continuity messages and messages of reassurance as well through those standardised channels.
And did you do anything specific with your managers that enabled them to deal with the remote population? Because again, for people who, perhaps whose experience has all been face-to-face, that can be a huge challenge.
Very much so, absolutely. So whole sort of people management, performance management, very much so. We were keen to, going back to the compassionate response point, keen to ensure that supervisors, line managers, middle managers understood that actually performance day to day might be more variable across the business, and that they need to understand individual reasons why that might be the case within their own units, within their own teams, and senior management and HROD supported that variation, if you will, by saying that actually we're going to suspend for a while our corporate KPI system, so that gave line managers the wherewithal to make those real-time micro adjustments, so that staff on the ground felt fully supported and not under duress, under what I think clearly was a very, very trying and arguably very stressful situation for many people.
No, absolutely. For you personally, Ian, if you don't mind me asking, how did you approach the challenges of home working?
Again, really interesting question, Kathy. So I like structure in my life. I'm a pretty sort of busy bee, busy job, and lots of other stuff going on outside with various charity boards that I'm involved with, etc. So I like structure. So it sounds an awful cliche, but in my case, it was true. You know, literally getting up for a short run each morning before getting into the day proper. Lunch break, very, very disciplined. And I'm very fortunate. I've got a marvelous PA, Phoebe. Who's very good at sort of ring fencing. You know, the middle bit of the day. That's when I'm not to be disturbed. And just having that time, which of course during lockdown, it's time spent in the kitchen making the lunch. So you need the time anyway. As I'm always reminding colleagues when they try to call me then. And then at the end of the day, I think having those boundaries, Kathy, between the working day and your own time is really, really important. So again, something practical, physical, whether it's going outside for a walk at the end of the afternoon or picking up a book, nothing to do with work, and just saying, right, okay, this is me time now. I'm not going to pivot to the beginning of my evening and the rest of my day.
And for you personally, has the experience changed for good how you work? So will you now work in a different way?
Yeah, again, I think there's been some positive elements, so, a legacy, if you will. So certainly more reflective and very conscious of the benefits of flexible working. I mean, I think had we had a conversation 2 years ago, had you been saying, your company, your employees about to go fully home working during the peak of the pandemic crisis, I absolutely would not have believed you. But the fact that not only like so many employers, we were able to make that shift so rapidly and carry on performing and doing what's required of us. I think there's some very, very positives there. In terms of my own sort of reflections on how it's impacted me, I think relationships become even more important. I'm in the office today, so making sure that I'm walking the floor, speaking to people, having those impromptu conversations when I can today, either side of preset meetings like now. So that's really important. So the relationship, the people side of the business is really, really important, I think.
Absolutely. And just finally, Ian, as an employer, what do you think will be the key legacy from the pandemic?
So I think a more mature attitude, as I say, around setting the parameters and the protocols around hybrid working going forward. As I said, there's no playbook, there's no how-to, and I think we're still finding our feet, learning best practice from other employers. I think making a really conscious effort that when you're in an office environment, as I am today, trying to utilise those opportunities for co-creation, joint working, collaboration, much more consciously, I think, than one might have otherwise been using office space previously.
Definitely. It's been incredibly valuable, Ian, to have that insight from such a, admittedly a small part, but of a larger public sector organisation, and to see the individualism that you've been able to introduce to that by working out what people wanted, as opposed to just simply assuming and taking a broad brush approach to it. So huge thanks for your time this afternoon. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure, Cathy. Thank you again for the invite. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Excellent.